Welcome back. Today we're talking about Chapter 3, Perceiving and Understanding. This comes from Julia Wood's textbook, Communication Mosaics. Wood's chapter questions are: what is perception? What factors influence our perceptions? How does the self-serving bias affect accuracy of our perceptions? Does mind reading help or hinder communication? And how can we use language to enhance our skill in perception? Remember that these focus questions appear on the first page of every chapter and are meant to give you a sense of how she focused the chapter and some of the topics that we'll be expanding upon in the voiceover lectures. First up, when we talk about perceiving others, we have the idea of first impressions. We've all heard about them. That first time you go into an interview, what do you wear? How do you shake their hand? What time do you show up? Because first impressions are crucial when it comes to how others are going to think of you from that point onward. It's actually very difficult to overcome first impressions. So I have a quick clip for you from 30 Rock. The sound is a little rough, but I think you get the gist. And the idea here is, how is the main character judging the people that she interacts with, and how is that going to affect any future interactions?
New York City, la-di-da. I'm sure it's a little bright in here. They could have rescheduled that youth karate class.
Yes,
But this is fun. Oh, come on, it's pathetic. Why am I doing this? Because you live in life. Hey, how you doing? You see Avatar?
Yeah, that new 3D is amazing.
Yeah, I don't know. I found myself rooting for our boys in uniform, not those blue hippies. But full disclosure, I had a couple of drinks prior, too. You know Liz?
Yeah, I thought that marine robot thing.
They weren't Marines. Some of them were former Marines, but they were mercenaries working for a space mining company.
All right. See you later.
What are you doing? I was warming him up for you, and you start talking about space mining? What, do you want to just sit around and be wrong? Come on, Liz. Every man in this room is single. Who do you want to meet? Nobody. I mean, that guy has a beard. Who knows what's under there? Tattoo guy? Too promiscuous. T-shirt tucked into jeans? Oh, that guy looks like he'd just be mean to me. God, Liz is so negative. Oh.
So what we see going on there is Liz scaring off the guy because she's acting like a know-it-all. He gets the impression she does not want to talk to him. And then she goes through and she gives her standards for everybody else that she looks at. And she's making a very quick assumption from across the room. And so really, she's not getting to know the people behind that first assumption. But that's often how it happens. So perception happens very quickly. It's a cognitive process, but it continues to affect our interactions. We'll talk a bit more about that here. So perceptions are inherently subjective. What this means is that they are very influenced by who we are, our experiences, our culture, how we understand the world, what we've done in the past, all of these things. Right? And there's 3 different steps to them. The first is that we select. Right, so we first perceive the particular things more than others, so what stands out to us. After we select particular pieces, we organize them in our brains, and we call these schemas or schemata. And then that organizing system helps us interpret what it is we're seeing. So we'll talk about biases and attributions. When we select perceptions, what's happening is we're often not choosing what to perceive. This is a largely unconscious, very immediate process. True, we can train ourselves to notice more, but in general, what stands out to us is different, is new, is unusual, inappropriate, unexpected, right? The thing that's different than the norm, or that we are surprised to see, or is just different than you've ever seen before, those are the things that you notice. But then over time, we get used to things, and so we stop noticing them as much. Right? So you think about your great aunt, and she sees you every year, and what she sees is how much you've grown in that time. Your parents, differently, probably don't notice quite as much because they see you every day, right? And so it's a much, much smaller change as you're growing up. Right? So selecting perceptions, the things that are unusual, are different, they stand out more for us. And this can happen a lot in the workplace. So we have the PC guy and the Mac guy, and one's in a suit, one's pretty casual. Interestingly enough, if you look at the Mac guy, he's pretty casual. There are some workplaces that he would actually fit in much better than the guy in the suit. And most likely he would fit in better at Apple than he would at, say, IBM. Right? IBM is far more of that suit place. And so there's not one right answer for what fits in for what is appropriate or inappropriate or the norm. It's very contextually based. After we've selected certain things to notice, we organize our perceptions. And again, we call these schemas, and I'll talk about 4 of them. And up in the right-hand corner, I have a file cabinet for you because this is a common metaphor for how we talk about schemas. We're organizing, we're using our cognitive file cabinet to figure out what is it that I'm seeing, how can I make sense of what's going on here. So the first schema we'll talk about is called a prototype. So when you think of a prototype, it's the best new fancy car that comes out. So a prototype is the clear or ideal example. This is like top of the pyramid, that's what you want. So for example, you watch way too many romantic comedies and that's your idea of what a relationship should look like, right? So that's your prototype. And if things, you judge your relationships by whether they live up to that or not. Or say you look at your parents' relationship and you say, okay, I definitely want that, or I definitely don't want that, right? Those are prototypes for you to then judge your own against. A script is exactly what it sounds like. It is a script of action. So if you walk into the coffee shop, you know who to talk to, you know what to say, right? You know how to order. So imagine going to a foreign country where you don't speak the language, or even if you speak the language, you haven't been there. And I know a lot of students in these classes have. And so you often don't know the script yet, right? You don't know, do you tip the cab drivers, or do you tip the restaurants, or do you not, right? Do you leave a certain percent? For instance, my partner was in Italy and he was reprimanded and learned that you do not order a cappuccino after breakfast. That is the only time that a cappuccino is acceptable. And so he learned the script for at lunch, you only order espresso. Here's how much it costs. Here's what you're going to get. Here's how you ask for it. Right? So a script is literally a script of the situation, of the context. A personal construct is what we call a mental yardstick. And so this is where you measure people on a scale, or you measure situations on a scale. Acceptable, unacceptable, attractive, not attractive, intelligent, not intelligent, fun, not fun. Right? So a personal construct is this yardstick. And then the last is a stereotype. And stereotype is a word that we throw around a lot in everyday conversation. When we define it, it is a predicted generalization about a person or situation, but this part's important. It's specifically based on their group membership, right? And so based on whatever group you think that person or that situation is a part of, if you make a generalization about them based on that group membership, that's a stereotype. So just saying something about that person isn't necessarily a stereotype. It has to be based on that group membership. So for example, we look at a map of the U.S., and this is only the lower 48 area of the U.S. So we have coffee lovers and hipsters up in the Pacific Northwest, and superficial blondes as we move down. Go a little bit east of there, and just Mormons. It's all Mormons through there. But then go north, we've got gun nuts, down to ski bums. That's Colorado-ish there. Texas is apparently all big hair. And then just corn. Corn in all the middle. Overweight beef lovers, we see a banjo for the South. Punditocracy is approximately around New York and D.C. Snooky, mean drivers, sports nuts, and then Florida down there are gym rats. So what we see here are stereotypes about different areas of the country, right? Oh, you're from California, this is what you're like. You're from Texas, this is what you're like. You're from the South, oh, I've already judged you based on where you came from. So when we organize, we use these 4 different schemas, and you should be able to tell me what they are, but then also offer examples of them. So we use those organizing schemas to try and make sense of a situation, right? If we haven't seen a situation before, we try and call on ones that we think are similar, right? To try and give us some sense of guidelines. So what happens is the more situations you're exposed to, the more different types of scenarios that you're in, you gain more cognitive complexity. You've experienced more things, you have more files in your file cabinet, more organizations and schema to make sense of new things, even if they're not identical to these ones you've had in the past, right? But you have more possibilities to call on to understand something. Primarily when we talk about interpreting perceptions, the main things we're going to focus on are called attributions. Attributions are when we attribute something to someone, right? So particularly a behavior to someone, and we're concerned with who or what is the cause of that behavior, right? So if, for instance, you're late to class, right? I might say, okay, you were late to class because you're lazy and you slept in and you couldn't be bothered to be here. So what I'm doing there is I'm saying that this is an internal attribution, right, that you had control of this and this is just the type of person you are. However, maybe I'm late and I say, well, I couldn't be here on time, there was an accident and there was traffic. And so I'm making an external attribution that says I had no control over this. This is not associated with the person that I am, right? So we also look at whether or not this is something we perceive as being changeable within a person or not, right? So if it's not changeable, we say this is a stable attribute. This is just something that's always the case. If it's not stable, this is something that someone can change, right? So if you put out enough effort, then you might succeed. Stable is just you're good at it or you're not, right? External says, all right, if there's no control over this, if this is unstable, then it's just luck that you got what you did, that you got the grade that you did, perhaps. But if this is a consistent situation and it's an external locus, it said, okay, you studied hard enough, this class is really hard, right? And so that effort and how hard the test was in particular are what led to a good result or a bad result. I'll give you another example of attributions with a visual, which helps a little bit. But first I want to talk about self-serving bias. And so within my example of why you were late, notice that when I talked about you being late, I said, oh, it's because you're this horrible person who slept in. But then when I talked about me being late, it's because it was inevitable due to traffic and an accident. And we tend to do that, and that's called the self-serving bias. And what it means is that you are biased in ways that serve yourself, right? So we tend to give ourselves the benefit of the doubt when it comes to attributions, but not to do that for others. This is something that we can step back and try and be aware of, but people's natural inclination is to try and have that self-serving bias. An example here based on racial stereotypes. So after Hurricane Katrina, there were some people who were left in the towns, many people who were left in New Orleans, and there was a lot of news reports about it. And so here we have two very similar images. One is of a young black man going through chest-high water with a bag of items, and the lower one are two look like white folks, also chest-deep water with bags of items. If we read the headline, we see a young man walks through chest-deep floodwater after looting a grocery store in New Orleans, whereas for this picture, two residents wade through chest-deep water after finding bread and soda. And so what happened here is not that the reporter went out and said, oh, right, I'm gonna say this terrible thing because this is a black person. Instead, what happened is there's this cognitive schema that says this is what black people are like, this is what white people are like. Here are my racial stereotypes, and it came out in the language that they used. Right? Other examples of attributions are, right, say you're a senior and you see incoming freshmen, right, and you think about, oh, I was never that bad, or they just haven't tried hard enough, or whatever it is, right? And so we make attributions about people who aren't us, and we base them on our previous experiences, but we do tend to be biased in relation to our schema, such as stereotypes that we hold, and also in relation to ourselves, and we give ourselves the benefit of the doubt. We also have something called the expectancy violation theory. And the expectancy violation theory really says how much are my expectations violated in this situation and in what ways, and that's going to affect how I make sense of the situation and how I interpret it. So the first thing that we look at is whether or not what happens is a positive or a negative violation, right? So something has happened, it violates what you expected to happen, so it's unexpected. Okay, but is it a good difference or a bad difference than what you were expecting, right? Did you get free money, or all of a sudden you got a horrible grade based on someone else's conduct, right? Those are examples of a positive or a negative violation. The next thing we look at is how much did what happened deviate from what you expected to happen. And the last we look at is how does the violation affect the relationship? Right? So these are all things that judge how are we going to look at this situation that has violated our expectations. My example for you, you're in the class and a puppy walks in, right? And often we are surprised by puppies. They're cute. A lot of people really like them. We see them around campus sometimes because of service dogs. And so it's not hugely unexpected. And for a lot of people, it's a very positive violation. They want to play with the puppy. It's cute. For some people with a bad dog experience, that can be an incredibly negative violation, right? Say you have a fear of dogs or you were horribly bitten. That can be a very negative violation. So it's going to be a very individual thing. In this case, the violation affecting the relationship doesn't really come into play. But then compare that puppy walking into the classroom compared to a streaker coming through. In most cases, that's going to be a negative violation, and it's going to be a really large deviation from our expectation, right? And so we have a bigger deviation there than we would with, say, the puppy. But if you want an example of how violations might affect a relationship, let's come to another example. Let's say your partner brings home flowers versus bringing home a secret lover. Right? I recognize this is a somewhat extreme example, but bear with me. Right? So bringing home flowers, no matter who you are, usually a positive violation. I don't know how big the deviation is from your expectation. Could be big, could be small, could be a nice surprise, could be something that's never happened before. And how does it affect the relationship? Usually positively, right? Unless there's extenuating circumstances that says, okay, how did you screw up? But anyway, usually it's a positive relationship. However, your partner brings home secret lover. Usually, that's going to be a very negative violation if you're in a monogamous relationship. Usually, that's going to be a very large deviation from what you expected, hence the secret part. And usually, that's going to be a very negative effect on the relationship because it is such a large negative violation. Right? So when we talk about expectancy violation theory, what we're talking about is the violation positive or negative? How much does it deviate from what we expected? And how is the violation going to affect the relationship? So again, these perceptions of the situation, of the violation, are things that help us make sense of it. It helps us organize it and then interpret it. That's really all I'm covering from this chapter. If you have more questions, I'd love to hear them. We're going to move forward and talk about social communities and perception. Cultures and social communities are profoundly important to how we think and how we know the world, right? What is our social reality? What stereotypes do we hold? What have we been exposed to? What are our biases and the attributions that we've learned from the social communities and the cultures that we're a part of? So next in this unit is talking about how to communicate across cultures and social communities and some of the communicative features that distinguish cultures and social communities from one another.